from the Real Story Group. I'm here with my colleague Sean Schell, and we're going to spend the next hour with you talking about what's so special about SharePoint. So the majority of this webinar is going to be conducted by my colleague Sean Schell, who's been a contributing analyst to the Real Story Group and SharePoint Watch now for several years. Sean is the founder and head of the technology consulting firm Consejo Inc., and we'll show you his contact information shortly. Consejo Inc. Develops solutions based off SharePoint and other portal solutions and offers technology strategy, advice, and consultation for enterprises around North America. So Sean's in kind of a unique position from sort of understanding SharePoint, not just from the business perspective, but also from very much from the technology side as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. So Sean, if you want to move us along. So a little bit of background about the Real Story Group and SharePoint Watch. Real Story Group used to be known as CMS Watch, was our previous name, and CMS Watch is still one of our three services. We're a research and evaluation company. The others being Enterprise Information Watch, focusing on enterprise technologies, CMS Watch focusing on web technologies, and then special research practice called SharePoint Watch, which you can find at SharePointWatch.com. And what we do is provide a subscribers-only research service for organizations who are either thinking about making a significant investment in SharePoint or perhaps already have made an investment in SharePoint or are thinking of extending it across the enterprise. So we have two different research streams, and you can go to SharePointWatch.com and learn some more about that. But in the meantime, let's get into the agenda, what we're going to cover today. First of all, what we're really trying to get at is kind of what's special about SharePoint and what's not particularly special. And I think we'll actually have a few surprises for you here. The things that we're going to zero in on in particular is SharePoint's dependence on the Microsoft stack. Its fundamental nature is an omnibus or sort of multi-capable platform. We'll touch on the SharePoint ecosystem and then what we call the drive to decentralize, or how SharePoint really does best in very decentralized organizations. Then we'll conclude with some advice and resources, and we'll certainly have enough time for you all to ask some questions. The way that you ask questions is just using the questions button, and you can submit those in writing, and then we'll take a look at them and try to get to as many as we can at the end. So let's move on then to what some of the core issues are here with SharePoint. And what we see a lot is different organizations within the enterprise sort of sometimes tossing SharePoint over the wall, sometimes for good, sometimes not for good. You have IT who sometimes believes that SharePoint can solve all of the business's problems. In other words, the business comes to them with a particular problem. We need a website. We need to share files. We need a portal. And sometimes IT, just to make their lives easier, will just default to SharePoint. On the other hand, you have on the business side sometimes a notion that, well, SharePoint can solve all of my problems. And so sometimes they'll pressure IT to just bring in SharePoint because they've heard that it can solve any number of different problems. And of course it can, but we obviously need a more nuanced view of this. What is special about SharePoint? What's unique about it? What's distinct about it? When should you really think about using it? So if we move on here to the next slide. So first, sort of what's not so special about SharePoint? Well, there's a number of different sort of mythologies that have sprung up, and like all myths, there's some partial truth to them. But you know, the first one is that, well, SharePoint is unique in providing great collaboration services. And the reality is that many other tools out there, including Jive, Lotus Notes and Connections, and dozens of others, also provide very good collaboration services. What's special about SharePoint here really is its emphasis on file sharing, but you can certainly find collaboration services ranging from very good to excellent from a number of different vendors. The other thing that's often lauded about SharePoint is ease of use, and for certain things, certainly SharePoint is very simple. But there are a number of other tool sets out there in this space that also provide great ease of use. Google, of course, being among the more famous among them, the various Google applications for being very simple to use. Then there's the other notion about SharePoint that it's very low cost. And while it can be, particularly if you're using the free sort of basic foundational version of SharePoint, now called SharePoint Foundation Services, formerly WSS, but SharePoint starts costing some real money when seat licenses start piling up, particularly if you're going to be getting the more feature-capable enterprise editions. Then, we've certainly talked to a number of enterprises who simply had too many knowledge workers to afford SharePoint at the levels that they wanted to purchase it. So it's not always, of course, there's no free lunch, and SharePoint is not always low cost. And then there's the notion, particularly with SharePoint 2010, that you're getting the latest and greatest technologies. And so, clearly SharePoint 2010, which we'll spend a fair bit of time talking about, is a significant upgrade. It's brought a number of very important enhancements both on the back end and the front end to SharePoint. But you have to remember that Microsoft is really on a 3-year development cycle. In fact, it's one of the longer development cycles compared to its competitors. So what can happen, particularly in very dynamic spaces like collaboration and social computing, is that some SharePoint services can get kind of out of date, and you might have to rely more on third-party services to get you where you want to go. So what is special about SharePoint? So I'm going to kind of set up this table, and then I'm going to let Sean kind of take it on home from here. And we really focus on 4 particular areas. And I'll introduce them, and then Sean will go into them in great detail. So here's what we think is particularly special about SharePoint. Doesn't mean that SharePoint is perfect or even ideal for you, but here's some really key differentiators. The first one is very close ties to Microsoft Server and the desktop, and the Microsoft desktop, particularly Office and Windows. And what that does is it helps improve the return on those investments that you've made. Now, on the downside, it also means that SharePoint sometimes creates challenges for more heterogeneous environments. If you're not, if you're dealing with many more types of documents than you'll find in Office, if your intranet infrastructure includes a number of non-Microsoft services, SharePoint tends to be very self-contained. The other thing that's special about SharePoint is a huge, I would say, in my experience, really unprecedentedly large army of Redmond partners who are waiting to implement, complement, and supplement SharePoint. So by implement, we mean consulting and integration, complementing and supplementing with third-party tools and modules, quite possibly the most dynamic and largest channel partner system that we see among any of the vendors we evaluate. The one thing is that this now becomes another variable, potentially an important variable in your success and something for you to master, dealing with all of these different partners and identifying which ones are the right ones. Certainly a lot of our research is geared towards helping enterprises understand some of the different competing solutions. Then the other thing that's really quite special about SharePoint is the extraordinary breadth of services that you find under one platform. Now, some of these services are better integrated than others, and certainly some are better than others, and we'll argue that very few of them are world-class, but certainly there's a plethora of different services, portals, to web content management, to business intelligence. And then finally, there is a really strong emphasis built into the tool from the beginning, and certainly reinforced in each subsequent edition, a real emphasis on individual and departmental empowerment. And this has been a traditional differentiator at a time when erstwhile competitors like IBM and Oracle and EMC tend to sell at the CIO level to senior IT people with an emphasis on enterprise control. Of course, the downside to this is that we've seen very often with SharePoint that it can lead to chaos, sprawl, and sometimes wasted investments. So that's just kind of setting it up. I think what I'll do here is turn it over to Sean to talk about, what are the 4 cases where SharePoint could be a good fit, along with some of the caveats. So, Sean, if you want to take it over from here and then bring us on home. And once again, if you have any questions, feel free to just pose them in the questions tab, and we'll be sure to try to answer them at the end. Sean.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate the intro. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I think there's really sort of 4 themes around SharePoint that we're going to focus on today, and one of them, SharePoint is special. If you've committed to the Microsoft stack, both on the server and the desktop, I think you'll find that SharePoint, sort of bar none, is probably one of the better tools out there And when we talk about the SharePoint stack, or the Microsoft stack in particular, what you see on the screen really is the SharePoint environment, the internal environment. Now this is representing SharePoint 2010. We realize, in fact, that there are a tremendous number of SharePoint 2007 customers out there. And this picture changes a little bit when you're talking about 2007, but I think it's representative here of the 2010 stack. If we look at the lowest level, it relies very heavily on Windows. And in fact, the newest version of SharePoint relies exclusively on the 64-bit version of Server 2008. We have Active Directory here listed and membership providers. One of the interesting features of SharePoint is that while Active Directory certainly is the preferential directory service for SharePoint, it is not the exclusive one. And we've seen customers implement everything from Sun 1 to Oracle Internet Directory to SQL membership to authenticate users. It is worthy of note, though, that some features are disabled in using third-party directory services, but while largely true in 2007, it has improved a bit in 2010. Up from that, you have the .NET Framework. This is key, and in fact, one of the biggest advantages or assets that SharePoint happens to have is the .NET Framework. If you have been watching the SharePoint space at all, or if you've been reading any of the blogs, you'll find an overwhelming number of very technically oriented blogs. Very few, in fact, on the business side, but an overwhelming number of technical blogs. And a lot of what these bloggers talk about is all of the things that you can do with SharePoint, oftentimes with code. What they probably aren't explicit about, in fact, is that many of the things you can do with SharePoint have very little to do with SharePoint and a lot to do with the .NET Framework. This is especially true when you're integrating with third-party tools or systems. SQL Server is a requirement, as is new IIS 7. And then on top of that is really the sort of starting the SharePoint world. So you can see half the diagram is non-SharePoint. It's really when you get into the foundational piece that you get specific into SharePoint and its capabilities. In the 2010 timeframe, what was interesting is that Microsoft pulled some services, interestingly, that were from the enterprise stack into the 2010 framework, namely what was called business data catalog, which is now called business connectivity services, which allows you to integrate third-party data services into SharePoint and display them like SharePoint lists. And then on top of that, you have all of the enterprise features, or standard and enterprise features, the components that Tony was discussing. BCS is listed there as well, but it does happen to exist in the foundational level. And it's really at the paid level, the enterprise and standard editions of SharePoint, you get all of the broad capabilities that we oftentimes hear associated with SharePoint. So again, still very Microsoft-centric, but it does work in Firefox and Safari. The experience is infinitely better, actually, in the 2010 timeframe, though it does have some shortcomings. You can store any file type you like in SharePoint. One of the myths is that you can only really work with Office. That's actually not true. You can put anything in there. I've seen JPEGs, open Office documents, even CAD drawings inside of SharePoint. The real limiting factor, though, is that SharePoint also has some capabilities to help you initiate the creation of content, and those services tend to be very tied to Office. With regard to productivity packages, however, Office is it. Microsoft did release recently some guidance on integrating third-party Office solutions like OpenOffice, for example. Unfortunately, nobody's really taken them up on the offer, and it appears that third-party solutions or third-party Office products aren't really supported. And in fact, it's interesting that Microsoft's own Mac version of Office isn't really overly supported as well. There's been some work in that regard, and there's some rumors that that will be changing in the next release of Mac Office, but nothing yet. A lot of the features are lit up inside of Office. Once you get to SharePoint, you can look at a collaboration space, for example, inside of SharePoint through Office. And in the Office 2010 timeframe, there's a new product or new feature called Backstage, which gives you a lot of the visibility into the SharePoint repository from the Office products, but also does things like related searches automatically for finding documents that might be related to the one you're looking at. But again, very focused on the Windows Server platform. It is worthy of note that Microsoft did make some changes to the integrations. So if you had external systems that you wanted to plug into SharePoint, there are a suite of web services which are actually now fairly robust and almost on parity with a lot of what SharePoint can do in the Windows environment, and you can begin to integrate those third-party systems and talk to SharePoint. We've actually done a number of integrations with third-party systems. It's not as hard as you expect, but it is very developer-centric. Where people often fall down with SharePoint, though, is this impression that it's simple. And you're probably going to hear me talk out of both sides of my mouth at some level, because while we do say it is relatively easy to set up and it's relatively easy to use, amazingly easy to use, in fact, in most cases, from an administration standpoint at the enterprise level, you're definitely going to need some good administration skills and development skills. Virtually every customer that we talk to, every client we work with, the story is repeated over and over again. You need somebody who understands the Microsoft server stack as well as SharePoint. It's also very likely you're going to need consulting help. SharePoint is specialized enough that you're going to want somebody who has done SharePoint implementations before. The constructs are different enough, this concept of a site or a site collection or a content type or a column. Just designing the architecture that you need to implement SharePoint inside of your enterprise takes some special skills. It's very likely that internal staff can learn as they go, especially working with a knowledgeable partner. And the subsequent changes or implementations of SharePoint applications can happen probably internally, but that first time around you're definitely going to want to look for consulting help. One of the other themes we tend to see a lot is because of the number of moving parts. You saw that stack diagram earlier that we showed. There are simply a lot of moving parts, and the challenge with troubleshooting SharePoint if there's an issue is that it could be any one of those things or a combination of those elements that cause the trouble. This is one of the reasons why good administration and development skills is really key. It's trying to figure out which one of those elements is causing the issue, which one of those things you need to patch or change. And so it does tend to make troubleshooting the environment a bit more complex. In 2010, some of the architecture changes that Microsoft made in the overall product make this a little bit more challenging even. Although I will say overall the architectural changes they made in 2010 improve the product a good deal and make it infinitely more scalable and better suited to larger enterprises. But again, the sort of moving parts problem is unique to SharePoint, I think. Now, SharePoint is also an excellent fit if you can master the ecosystem. What you see here on this screen is another diagram of what we would call the SharePoint ecosystem. And again, we're saying to SharePoint 2010. This applies equally as well to 2007, not just 2010. Looking from the bottom up, you start kind of with this idea that you get SharePoint and everything that it provides in the box. And there are a good deal of services and functionality in the box. As Tony mentioned earlier, there's a fairly wide array of capability inside of SharePoint as a product in and of itself. And some early design goals that Microsoft had for the product was that you could set it up quite easily and get productive quite easily. However, once you get past that initial installation and implementation, you see a lot of organizations wanting to change it and to manipulate SharePoint into something that either better suits their environment or looks more like their internal organization. We would recommend sort of the first thing you begin to look at are the community assets. And as mentioned earlier, SharePoint has a fairly big ecosystem. And one of the big assets that SharePoint benefits from at the moment is that there's a healthy open source community around SharePoint development. Codeplex is Microsoft's website where they post a lot of the open source tools that they themselves developed as well as others. And they also, on their own sites, Microsoft.com, release solution packs, accelerators, and kits. The software development kit is an example. There's an accelerator around blogs that actually hosted in Codeplex, but it was written by Microsoft folks initially. Once you get beyond that, you get into management services, archiving, web part collections, administrations, accelerators. These are largely third parties providing these tools, and there's a ton of third-party providers out there. More often than not, we see customers buying one or more of these third-party packages in order to really complete the solution. Again, you can implement SharePoint pretty quickly without too much in the way of extras, but once you get using it heavily, there are definitively some deficiencies. Search tends to be the one that people focus on a good deal. Archiving is another one that tends to be out there. From an IT operations standpoint, managing a SharePoint farm can be a challenge with the in-the-box tools. Some of that's improved in the latest version, but companies like IDevFactor and Acceler make management tools that effectively make managing SharePoint kind of on par with the rest of the enterprise systems that are out there. You also have a set of supplemental services, things that SharePoint either doesn't do overly well or doesn't do at all. Workflow is something that SharePoint actually does reasonably well in the box, but workflows are typically confined to the SharePoint environment and not outside. So if you want to connect a SharePoint workflow to a larger business process automation workflow, you're going to have to buy a third-party product. Some of the social computing features inside of SharePoint are actually quite good, but again, they're very SharePoint-centric, and they may not do everything that you want, and so there's a number of vendors out that provide social computing add-ons. Digital asset management is something SharePoint really doesn't do at all for intents and purposes, as well as capture and imaging, and again, third-party tools do exist out there to help you add that capability to your SharePoint environment. And then sort of up and down the stack, you obviously have system integrators, consultants, and training organizations. We see clients pretty regularly forget the training component. We see that as a critical element of success inside of SharePoint. Those organizations that tend to invest early on in training and adoption and governance around SharePoint tend to be the most successful because, as Tony mentioned, it can get out of hand quite quickly without proper training, reinforcement of that training to your end-use community. It ends up causing a good deal of trouble. If you want a solution, frankly, that is sort of gives you everything in the pack or everything in the box, or a good many of it in the box, SharePoint is also a good fit. It is definitely the jack of all trades. The other side, of course, is that it's the master of none, but it is definitely a jack of all trades and can give a fairly wide breadth of services available without too much in the way of extras. If you look here, this is actually the SharePoint donut diagrams. These donut diagrams are produced by Microsoft to kind of give you a sense of where SharePoint fits. We call them the pillars. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the 2007 pillars. These are the services, the core features that SharePoint should be providing out of the box: collaboration, portal, search, content management, business forms, business intelligence. And then the core of that are all the sort of basic components. If you think about it from this perspective, at least in that diagram in particular, the outer core, the outer ring is the enterprise or standard features of SharePoint, inner features. The inner ring is the WSS features, those things that you get for free. In the 2010 timeframe, the donut changes a bit. And this, I think, reflects both changes in the marketplace 3 years hence from the 2007 to the 2010 version. It reflects Microsoft's own change in thinking about how they're positioning the product. And it shows kind of where they're headed from a strategy perspective. So you now have this concept of sites, which is a basic construct inside of SharePoint for creating collaborative spaces, creating these communities. Content management is a key component of the solution. Web content management in particular hasn't changed a good deal in the 2010 timeframe. Search, however, has, with the addition of the fast search engine and also improvements to the core engine. Insights, this is probably the area where 2010 has changed the most, adding a lot of BI features from the Performance Point product early on, as well as some new add-ons from SQL Server. And this is a good example of where SharePoint relies on a lot of other things in the Microsoft suite. So a portion of what's in the Insights is a new feature coming out of SQL Server to do very large pivot tables. Power Pivot, the product's called. Composites, this is kind of a new theme for Microsoft, creating a composite application on top of the SharePoint platform. And again, this is largely about the .NET framework and the surrounding Microsoft ecosystem rather than SharePoint capabilities necessarily. But again, this represents the sort of jack of all trades. They're trying to capture a lot of capabilities in one product, and more or less successfully doing so. We've seen lots of very interesting applications built on top of SharePoint successfully. So when we talk about all of these capabilities, one of the ones that we hear a good deal about is web content management. This is an example, in fact, of the kind of thing that SharePoint provides. Again, it's a pretty average WCM tool. Provides the basic capabilities to create a page and manage a page, rich text editing, being able to add new sections of the site pretty easily, all browser-based. There's a site on the web at the moment called WSS Demo that actually shows you all of the sites being run on SharePoint by industry, and there are a good many of them. One of the other advantages is you can contribute through Office. As Tony mentioned early on, one of the themes was empowering the individual user and smaller departments. And one of the key tools that many of these users and groups have available to them is the Office product. So Microsoft was keen to make the experience of contributing content through that primary tool. So you can create a blog in Microsoft Word and publish that blog to a SharePoint blog. You can create a web page in Word and publish it. In the new capabilities in 2010, you can actually create a theme, a new look and feel inside of PowerPoint of all tools, and publish that new look and feel directly to your SharePoint site and make your SharePoint site look like the PowerPoint presentation. And again, this is one of those sort of key elements of the SharePoint success, is that it's really accessible to end users and doing it through the tools that they're very used to using on a day-to-day basis, rather than making them learn HTML or some other specific tool. Again, it also does tend to highlight SharePoint's ease of use. Now, with regard to WCM, it's not the best WCM tool. It is very page-centric. SharePoint doesn't really have this concept of a real granular control over content. When you create a new page in SharePoint, you create a page. That page is made up of a few multiple content blocks. And you could theoretically reuse content within those blocks of that page, but it requires a developer to do so. It also tends to focus on the physical orientation of pages as a way of creating navigation. So when you create a page in the context of a specific section of your site. That's where the page lives. If you want that page to show up in your navigation elsewhere on the site, it's not as easy. It's very doable, but it requires a developer. It generates relatively ugly URLs. The names of the pages are there, but it's got a kind of a strange URL structure that includes the name of the library, which is how it stores pages in this concept of a library. It stores the library name, or shows the library name, inside of the URL. And often this library is called pages, and so it tends to be not as attractive and could adversely impact search engine optimization and your position within search results. And then there's this last statement about comparatively more developer-centric. Tony and I were actually talking about this earlier. And you probably could go either way in this regard. There was this original goal of Microsoft to make SharePoint's production of websites relatively straightforward. We're going to eliminate all the things that people have to do, like building navigation. We'll make that kind of an automatic thing. We will eliminate all of those repetitive kinds of tasks, constructing a template as an example. We'll give you a bunch of templates out of the box. And that actually works quite well, assuming you like the way those templates are constructed and you're okay with the way the navigation displays. And so that very simple example, again, works incredibly well inside of SharePoint. When you get to more complicated scenarios, you tend to have more of a need to get into developer-centric kind of activities. And to Microsoft's credit, there is a sort of middle ground, and that is a product called SharePoint Designer, which is free. You can do a good deal with SharePoint Designer and not necessarily be a developer. You can be largely focused on HTML and dragging and dropping objects onto a design surface inside of SharePoint Designer. That actually works pretty well for certain kinds of operations, and in fact there's a few blogs out there kind of dedicated to the non-code solution around SharePoint. But again, it depends on your perspective. I would say that there's definitely a heavy developer bent for this for most websites. Most of the websites you're going to see on WSS Demo, for example, had developers involved, but it is possible to create a non-developer site. And the fourth and final theme is you want to really empower individuals and departments and control the results. This, again, is one of the strengths of SharePoint, very focused on the local individual, the small department, making it very easy to create new things. This was probably the result or the reason for its very early success. You could install it. You could give people the ability to create new collaborative sites, to create documents, to instantly share things. And for what it's worth, you're seeing in the marketplace other products that mimic a lot of those capabilities being successful. Google Sites, for example, or Google Docs, giving the power to the end user to produce new sharing constructs and then giving them the ability to control it. SharePoint was one of the early products that did that. It's also very easy to install. Depending on who you talk to, if you talk to an IT department, for example, or you talk to a technical person, especially one who's gone through an enterprise deployment of SharePoint, this theme of easy to install may not have come up. But the basic installation of SharePoint really only takes a couple of clicks, and it can be installed on a lot of different operating systems. The newest version supports Windows 7 and Vista, in fact, so you can install it on a desktop if you wanted, or you install it on a server 2008. Again, basic installation doesn't really take a whole lot. You can download Windows SharePoint Services or the new version of Foundation for free. Even the SQL Server requirement is taken care of by a free version or a desktop version of SQL Server. And in our consulting business, we've actually seen a lot of customers start out with rogue SharePoint implementations underneath someone's desk, for better or for worse. But it's, it demonstrates the sort of very groundswell, bottom-up kind of approach to making SharePoint available inside the enterprise. And again, the ability to create these constructs is actually quite easy. If I wanted to provision a new collaborative space or a new site for something, I can do that right through Office. If I had a Word document up, I could say I want to create a new shared workspace. Point to my SharePoint environment. It'll create a document workspace around that document, and then I can select the members to whom that site should be directed or who will have access to it, all within Office. With the latest version, you can even take all of that content offline and create new things offline and synchronize it when you're back online through the new product called SharePoint Workspace, which is the old Groove product. I wish Microsoft would actually stop changing product names. It's difficult to remember them all. But the idea is that a lot of these things are made very accessible and very easy. So for very simple and straightforward scenarios, it's pretty easy. Now, what isn't it really good for, and where do we end up creating challenges? Well, governance tends to be a fairly big problem in the SharePoint space. Many organizations don't pay enough attention to it, but SharePoint also doesn't provide a lot of facilities for governance. So there's really no inherent governance model inside of SharePoint. Microsoft and others have produced governance frameworks, largely IT-centric, not so much business-centric. So you could probably get a pretty good sense of how to care and feed for the SQL server, but perhaps not how long you should keep a collaborative workspace operational without use, as an example. Most organizations pay very little attention to care and feeding, and one of the most popular add-on features, in fact, is the backup, recovery, and archiving components that a number of vendors sell. And as a result, or in addition to, many of these rogue developments or rogue deployments that were installed under someone's desk kind of get out of hand quickly. We had one client that had 600 or 700 sites virtually overnight because they had an uncontrolled environment. They sort of set it up and let people do what they want, and there was an absolute explosion. That's probably the worst case scenario. And then we have other clients who were probably too draconian in their management and had very little uptake. Right? So I think the success is probably straight down the middle. You want to have enough governance around SharePoint to ensure it's used properly, but not be overly watchful or overly top-down and stifle the sort of natural progression of SharePoint environment. With large deployments, there also tends to be some challenges. There are certainly plenty of large deployments of SharePoint. In fact, lots of deployments over 100,000 employees. But there are some architectural challenges that even haven't been resolved in the 2010 timeframe that make those larger deployments more of an issue than smaller ones. So when you get over 100,000 employees, things like My Sites become somewhat problematic because there's an architectural limit to the number of site collections you can have in a single environment. In the 2007 timeframe, you had some data limits, the number of list items, which is the basic sort of storage construct of SharePoint, the number of documents that you could have in a library, for example. 2010 has largely removed a lot of those particular limitations, but there are still some basic limitations. The one biggie is, actually two of them, file size limits for an individual files, 2 gigs or less, largely owed to SQL Server as its storage mechanism, as well as content databases that shouldn't get over 100 gigs. And there's a whole bunch of technical discussion that we could have around how to best architect it, but the point is that when you get into very large environments, very large deployments, there are definitively some challenges in doing so. The other part of it is sort of multi-geographical deployments. SharePoint does not support replication. There is a vendor right now that does provide replication services to SharePoint, but it's not supported in the box. And so when you have geographically dispersed organizations, global organizations who want to collaborate between employees that are housed on opposite ends of a big ocean, that becomes problematic and requires a good deal of planning and thought to implementing an environment that works well for all involved. And companies like Riverbed Technologies and Certian have made a good deal of money on SharePoint with WAN acceleration devices because there's, so network heavy and network dependent. Those tools tend to be used pretty frequently. In the 2010 timeframe, though, there were some improvements. Microsoft introduced the concept of just sending changes over the wire rather than the whole document. They now have a few services to provide edge caching inside of SharePoint, which means we can have a server sort of locally that's not the primary storage mechanism, but it's going to save a copy of something that's sort of in use in that geography and then only send back the changes to the central environment when necessary. So again, some of this has improved a bit over time, but there are still some challenges at hand. And then finally, SharePoint, as we've mentioned, does a lot of things. It's a jack of all trades. It's just not a master of anything in particular. And in part, I think that's probably why it's been successful, because it can provide a lot of services and you can do a lot of things. You actually hear consultants say that a lot. Well, you can do that. It just requires a little work. And I've seen bloggers with that same sort of attitude. You theoretically can accomplish virtually anything you put your mind to with SharePoint, because again it benefits from the .NET framework, this enormous ecosystem of vendors that provide add-on solutions. It's very capable in and of itself, but again you have to think through what makes the most sense. I don't think it's a good policy to just default to SharePoint because you own it, which many organizations tend to do. I think you probably have to carefully evaluate whether it's the right tool in a given situation. We looked at WCM, for example. If you only had to do web content management, if you're only going to power a website, is SharePoint the right tool? Maybe not. If you needed to do that, and you needed to manage documents, and you'd really like to do a blog, and you wanted to have some sort of business intelligence capability, SharePoint certainly makes a good deal more sense. But don't just default to SharePoint. Think it through a bit. Very key advice around governance, probably, again, the one thing that most clients tend to ignore until it's too late. We typically advise our clients that should be an upfront discussion, a thoughtful discussion around how are you going to manage this going forward. What's the right place, or where is the right place inside of SharePoint to put a particular document? What's the right metadata to apply to that document? How long should that document live inside of the SharePoint environment before perhaps it's either moved to third-party storage, or it's deleted, or it's sent up for review? All of these things are key. And finally, I think you're going to want to look at third-party suppliers of tools. I don't think you're going to get away from that. It is probably one of the key areas that you're probably not going to get away from. Most companies end up buying one or two third-party products. Most often I've seen is certainly around search add-ons, management add-ons, and then secondarily those things that perhaps SharePoint doesn't do well, like trying to create some sort of digital asset management tool, or enhancing the social computing capabilities of SharePoint, or even doing something like document imaging. But you should absolutely look at those third parties much like you look at any vendor. Many of them are very small. Many of them have challenges around support. So pick your vendors carefully. There's a number of larger vendors out there that do pretty well. So I'd advise you to take a look at those first. And then finally, we have resources you can go to for more information. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tony.
Great, thanks, Sean. So we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. You can get more information at SharePointWatch.com, where you can see our different SharePoint research streams, and subscribe to our research if you're thinking about making a deeper investment in SharePoint or comparing SharePoint to other tools. We provide a lot of charts and other information and analysis for you to make better decisions. It doesn't really matter to us which way you go with SharePoint, but just that you make good decisions. You can also catch up with what some of the things that Sean is doing at the Consejo blog there at consejoinc.com. If you want a copy of this presentation, just send a message to our general email box, info@realstorygroup.com, say that you were on this webinar and you'd like a copy, and we'll get that off to you in the next 24 hours or so. We do have an archive of this entire presentation, including the audio, and that's available to our SharePoint Watch research customers. So if you are a customer of Real Story Group or SharePoint Watch, in the next couple days you'll be able to log into your account and share this with your colleagues. You can follow us on Twitter at SPWatch as well. We're constantly updating everything that we're doing around SharePoint, some of the information we can share with you. So, Sean, we've got a number of really good questions coming up in here, so I want to go through them kind of quickly. But one of the themes that keeps coming up is, yeah, you can do this, take some development work. You can SharePoint at some level is a platform, and you can make sophisticated WCM and other applications. And of course, that always begs the question: should you do it? And I know this comes up with a lot of open source platforms like Drupal. Can you comment on the way that Redmond markets SharePoint to end user enterprises versus its channel of consulting partners?
Well, what we've seen is that Microsoft's messaging around SharePoint as a product to end user communities tends to be, we're going to enable you by giving you all of this capability, and then you can kind of decide how to use it. We have lots of features in the box, and here are all these things that you can accomplish with very little effort. And I think the messaging to the partner channel tends to be a little different, and that message tends to be more, SharePoint's not really a product so much as it is a platform. And with that platform, you can accomplish lots of things, and there's plenty of work for you partners to do for clients or on their behalf to accomplish whatever they happen to need. And it depends on who you talk to, and I don't know that the messaging is as stark as I perhaps presented, but that's very clearly two different messages that are being delivered to the overall market. Both messages, in fact, are true, but I would, again, I would caution anyone who says, well, we can just do it with SharePoint. SharePoint is the tool. It's not always the tool, and you need to be careful.
Yeah. So another question that came in was kind of a series of questions. And other people had questions about storing images and other large binaries in SharePoint. One person in particular was interested in Photoshop files, PSDs, TIFFs, very large CAD files. And it's kind of a two-parter. Like, first of all, are there any limitations, and what does this mean as far as like database performance since they're being stored in the database? Then the other question was, does SharePoint natively understand any embedded metadata like IPTC or XMP? So the second one is particularly complicated, but do you want to just kind of generalize about that real quick?
I think the answer in general is that large files are okay, again with the constraint of the 2 gigs. From a database performance standpoint, there really isn't one. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that SQL Server handles large files in and out of the database actually just fine. And in fact, there is an alternate approach, and this is recent to 2010, something called remote blob storage, which allows you to take the blobs out of the database, stick it on the file system, and let SQL Server sort of manage the location. There isn't any limitation there, but there are certainly files, especially CAD files, that get over 2 gigs. And the other thing I would caution you on is there's just a physics problem of pushing that much data for a singular file over the wire. With the ability to difference files, it's kind of improved in 2010, but if you're doing that over long distances, it's just not going to be very performant.
Right.
With regard to the embedded metadata, the answer is yes. I'm not totally familiar with the two standards that were described, but I know, for example, images, it will pull out a lot of the data that comes with a JPEG from a camera, for example, and display that. It largely depends on the kind of construct that you create inside of SharePoint. The images library, for example, out of the box kind of understands a lot of the image metadata that's inherent in the document. PDF files come with built-in metadata that is understood, and it goes without saying that everything in Office is sort of understood well as well.
So the other question is a pretty simple one, but it kind of an important. It seems simple, but maybe not once you dig into it. Which is, does SharePoint integrate with Outlook, and if so, how? So that seems like a really important business person's question.
The answer is a couple of fold. Yes, SharePoint integrates with Outlook, and that integration is changing a little bit. In 2007, there was an automatic integration with contacts. So if you had a contact list inside of SharePoint, you can surface that inside of Outlook as a contacts list inside of Outlook. So you can actually send email based on those contacts. If you added a contact inside of Outlook, it would replicate to SharePoint and add that to the SharePoint list and vice versa. That actually worked quite well. You can surface calendar items from a calendar list in SharePoint or an event list inside of SharePoint into Outlook. However, it was a one-way. You couldn't add calendar items to your Outlook version of the calendar and have them show up on the list. And then finally, you could take portions of the lists for a document library, for example, offline inside of Outlook. But again, it wasn't synchronizing back to SharePoint. In 2010, that's changed a bit. Many of those things are now two-way. And there's a few more goodies, forms inside of Outlook, better offline experience for documents inside of Outlook, and then all of the other sort of capabilities, like if you, and this is actually true in 2007 as well, but if you wanted to schedule a meeting in Outlook, you can create a meeting workspace inside of SharePoint automatically for that meeting and tie it all together.
But one of the lingering issues really with SharePoint has been something of a wall sometimes, it seems like, between the Exchange group and the SharePoint group and at SharePoint, at Microsoft, and a sense, I think I know a lot of people desiring that they wish that there was kind of greater intimacy there, and customers expecting it, particularly some larger customers, and being surprised when it wasn't there.
Yeah, I not being a part of the product group, it's difficult for me to comment too deeply on that. But there's been this ongoing desire in the market, for example, to get rid of public folders in lieu of SharePoint sites, to do something a bit more integrated around scheduling with SharePoint and creating a sort of common group calendar instead of through Exchange. And I guess for a whole bunch of reasons, those things have not happened yet. And there's some discussion on the Microsoft SharePoint blog around the whys and wherefores, as well as on the Exchange side. I think honestly that a lot of things are going to change over the next couple of years, but again, it's the typical story of it's the next release.
Great. A couple people asked about the Real Story Group and whether, in SharePoint Watch, and whether we were producing a kind of a SharePoint evaluation report for 2010. And what we've done under our new model is we're kind of slipstreaming research out there to subscribers. So you can subscribe for 3 months or a year, and we've already put out coverage of search and the search ecosystem in SharePoint. We're about to do one on the collaboration ecosystem, including integration with Jive and others. And within the next month or so, we'll have research out on SharePoint 2010 as an ECM service and then as a WCM service. So those of you who are subscribers to our SharePoint streams will get automatic access to those updates, and then we'll be updating all those on kind of a rolling basis rather than a single big bang report. So got another question about licensing, and licensing is always complicated. We could probably spend a whole hour talking about it, but someone wanted to know, like, what are the key considerations for understanding licenses, particularly a public website versus a corporate intranet?
Well, that's an excellent question, and what was interesting is that the last SharePoint conference, unlike previous conferences, had a whole session on licensing, which unfortunately didn't really provide any additional insight. But the short story is, for public websites in particular, you license the server version of SharePoint, and in the 2010 timeframe, you actually get to license the standard version. In 2007, you had to license the enterprise version. So the enterprise version is still available in 2010, but you have a less expensive alternative as well. Once you license the server, in lieu of individual CALs for everybody in the world, you license what amounts to what Microsoft would call an Internet Connector license. And the Internet Connector license essentially gives you an unlimited number of non-employee connections to SharePoint. So this would be true of a public website as well as an extranet where you were providing access to a number of even known entities. The license is based on a per server basis, so that means that if you have a medium farm with 2 web front ends, the controls necessary to secure all that. Beyond that, there's basically, if you're internally focused, it's client access license based, and there are really 2 client access licenses that you have to be concerned about. The standard client access license and the enterprise client access license. If you want enterprise features, you sort of had to buy both of them together. That's not really changed all that much. So I think the standard license was $94 or something, and the enterprise was $74 on top of that, times the number of employees you might have. Many organizations get benefit from an EA, and so for specifics about your organization, I would totally recommend you talk to a position within Microsoft called a licensing specialist. There's one for your sort of organization type, large enterprise, medium enterprise, that sort of thing, as well as geography. So talk to your salesperson, get a licensing specialist, and have a deep and meaningful discussion with them about licensing, because it's not easy to understand. So it seems we've lost Mr. Byrne, and not sure if he's going to be joining us again. Melinda, can you locate Tony? Well, we're actually just about at 2 o'clock, so I think that we'll probably sign off at this point. I hope that you've all found this presentation useful and helpful. And again, if you have any questions, follow us on SP Watch. You can email requests for the presentation to info@realstorygroup, and then certainly SharePointWatch.com and ConsejoInc.com can give you more insight into SharePoint and its use inside the enterprise. So with that, I appreciate your time today, and on behalf of Tony Byrne and the rest of the Real Story Group, I hope you have a pleasant afternoon.